Thank you very much. As I was listening to the questions and I was thinking about the cities, the London, New York, Paris, and what's the difference between them and Tokyo? And the big difference is that the first three are very multicultural. So maybe when you see Abe tomorrow, you can urge him to accept, and I'm dead serious, to accept 100,000 refugees from Syria to come to Japan, and in 20 years, you will have a very different society. And the multicultural nature of it, and intermarriage is the only solution I know of, is a really important one. Because frankly, this is the best city in the world. I used to come here 10 times a year, and I miss that, and coming in from the airport yesterday reminded me how much I missed coming to Tokyo. So I'm going to start, and I don't see a clock. Is there a clock someplace, or can we put one? Because I want to stick to my 40 minutes pretty accurately. I wanted to start with an explanation that most people don't know, and that is why the MIT Media Lab is so grateful to Japan, because it really started in Japan. And the reason it started in Japan is you heard that I am the co-founder, but very few people ever ask, who's the other one? Who is the other co? And the other co happens to be a man, he died about 20 years ago, named Jerome Wiesner. And what's key about Wiesner is that he was Jack Kennedy's science advisor. When Jack became president of the United States, he brought Wiesner, who was a close friend, and they knew each other, they sailed together, they were really quite close, to be his science advisor. And one of the first things the President of the United States did was say, Jerry, go to Japan and help the Japanese rebuild their technology, and particularly in the world of electronics. So Jerry came to to Japan in the early 60s and met with a lot of the companies, the typical ones, Toshiba, Hitachi, Mitsubishi, Matsushita, you name them. 20 years pass. Kennedy is assassinated. Wiesner comes back to MIT. He becomes the president of MIT. It's always good to have the president be your partner. We come to Japan to present the idea of the Media Lab, which had not been well received, or at least wildly received in the United States. But when he got to Japan, guess what? The people whom he had seen 20 years before because of President Kennedy were then the CEOs and the chairman and the chief technology officer of all of these big companies. And in your culture, you have very big memories. You are very grateful and you remember people. And if somebody was very helpful to you 20 years ago, you will be very helpful to them. That's a wonderful trait. And so we benefited from that history, and people in Japan basically welcomed the idea, funded the idea, and when we went back to the United States, we had basically such momentum from Japan, we were able to then use it in the United States. And that's very, very true. And a second thing, which is there's a lot of personal aspects to my talk today, because there are a lot of memories that come back. But one of them, and I'll talk about it a little bit in my presentation, but I had Kenzo Tange as a professor. And when you have Kenzo Tange as a professor, you don't forget it. And when I saw him throughout what was his life, he was always very generous. And I knew Fumihiko Maki, who was teaching at Harvard at the time, and ended up designing the beautiful Media Lab building we have today. So there are lots of circles that come around, at least in my life, my institution's life, and in sort of the life I know, that always seem to come back to Japan. There's always a point in Japan where now our director is Japanese. The second language at faculty meetings is Japanese, because we've got 3 faculty who speak Japanese, and they don't hesitate to speak to each other in Japanese. And when John Maeda was there, he'd add into the Japanese. So this is home. This is a homecoming, and it's very, very important for you to think about it that way. So then when I was asked, what would I talk about? Well, I studied architecture, and I've always been interested in cities. And again, because of my age and history, I had people like Buckminster Fuller as professors and sort of great opportunities to think in the ways we want to think today, sort of again, coming around. And the part that always interests me are differences, because differences is where new ideas come from. New ideas don't come from homogeneous thinking. They don't come from people who all have the same background. They don't come from people who all have the same age, who all are from the same culture, all are the same gender. You need differences. And very often the differences actually lead to misunderstandings. You say something, and the other person may actually not even hear it correctly, or may misinterpret it and respond to you. It's not what you meant. And you say, wow, that's a great idea. What an interest, I hadn't thought about it that way. So sometimes it's even accidental, but it comes from differences. So I think maximizing difference is very important. And it takes a heterogeneous environment. I believe it has to be culturally heterogeneous, certainly intellectually, and so on and so forth. So now I said I would talk a little bit again. I'm perhaps being a little bit too personal, but when I was a child, first of all, I always lived in cities. In fact, my entire life, I have never lived anywhere but in a city. And it used to be the case, I was born and brought up, insofar as I was brought up in any one place, I was brought up in New York, in Manhattan. Now, what do you have to be to grow up in Manhattan? You have to be rich. Because otherwise, what do? You move to the suburbs because of the cost of living. Then you move because it's safer. Then you move because you might have a piece of grass. And then you move because in the American education system, it is stupidly paid for by real estate taxes. So you can be in a place that has a higher tax that makes a better school. So people left. So in my generation, if you will, we left the city. We went away from it. The rich people stayed. Some maybe even had bodyguards. Some had chauffeurs. You lived in, with a doorman, and it was wonderful, but for very few people. And now, it's changing. Now, not only are people coming back, but I think the suburbs are dead. What young person do you know who would want to live in the suburbs? None. They don't want to commute, even though you can bring a Kindle and read books. They don't want to commute. They want to be where action is. All of our zoning laws 30 years ago were about land use. This is for offices. This is for factories. This is for residential. Stupid. Stupid rules. Mixed use. You want to be able to go from your apartment to cafes to offices to whatever. In other words, we've changed quite substantially. But when I went to school, and the reason I'm showing this slide is that I personally did very well in art. I did very well in math, and I went to see my headmaster, and I said to the headmaster, and I was in the last year of what we would call high school, and I said, because I am good in math and because I seem to be good in art, I clearly should go study architecture. And this man was so wise that I didn't understand what he told me. Because what he told me was, Nicky, I think he called me Nicky at that age, I like gray suits and I like pinstriped suits, but I don't like gray pinstriped suits. And I thought, what the hell are you talking about? So I didn't think about it. I went to architecture school. I loved it. I would do it over again. I recommend it to everybody as a general education and as a professional education. But at the end of architecture school, I realized that my pinstriped suit was computers, not architecture. And the one person I was able to persuade and who became a very dear friend was Steve Jobs. I said, Steve, it's about art. It's about art and technology. Those aren't separate questions. They are a single question. And that has been, for me, the single question in my life. So when I started, I still thought I was an architect. I still thought that maybe the way to make this pinstriped suit was to bring computers and architecture together. And this is a piece of work done in 1968. And it looked like architecture. It felt like art. It was computer-aided design until I realized, it took me a while, that it wasn't to design cities and environments on computers, but it was maybe to think of them as computers. Maybe buildings are computers we live in. And maybe they are built without architects. And the reason I put that sentence there is that in the 1960s, there was an extraordinary show at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It was a book by the same name called that, Architecture Without Architects. Had a huge impact on me. It was a man named Bernard Rudofsky, who also came to MIT as a professor. And the idea was that if you look at architectural environments, typically, Italian villages and towns on tops of mountains and so on, that they evolved by the people building them with a set of tools that were sufficiently limited in that case, or you did things like paint the houses white in order to reflect the sun or to keep the bugs out, that gave a homogeneous character to the architecture that makes it quite splendid, and that is where we could go. Now, this was in 1968. So in 69, I said, well, let's do an experiment. And I have always found, and people at the Media Lab find this all the time, that one of the places to experiment with ideas is in museums. Museums can be places for the bellwether of tomorrow. This has happened over and over again. I think it happens in the Maury Museum. It's happened time and time again. I happened to do it in a museum in New York called the Jewish Museum, and we built an environment. I need to get the slide back. We built an environment that looked like habitat that had just happened a couple of years before, and it was inhabited by gerbils. Gerbils are little things like rats, and they run around, and this robot would build the environment, and if the gerbils moved it, it would make a decision as to whether that was intentional or accidental. The decision being how much a block was moved. This is all fantasy, but people would go back and see this architecture evolve as the gerbils moved it over days and weeks, actually. So MIT became, because it's the kind of place that does that, became a place where we could do things where academic departments were like Swiss cheese. They had holes in them, and you could go through the walls. And I started to believe that almost everything could be done without anything. And by anything, I should probably say anything you would expect. Now, think about today. Who is the biggest limousine service? It is a company without cars. Who is the biggest hotel? It's a company without rooms. Who is the biggest school? It's a school without classrooms. So almost everything that we think of, the biggest version of it right now, the most popular, is without the elements that we usually thought were the functional and required constituent parts. And they may not be. That changes a city. So what I do in general, and I will do a little bit, and just to warn you, I'm going to end up with a recommendation that is so extreme that you may or may not accept it, but I'm usually invited to these to give extreme recommendations. So it's coming at the end. But the way I think is I ask myself every morning, will normal market forces do what I am doing today? And if the answer is yes, then stop doing it, Nicholas, because normal market forces will. My role, I've thought this my whole life, was to do what normal market forces don't do. And the reason I'm interested in that is that I feel very, very strongly that the things that I cherish in my life, and I suspect the ones that you cherish in your life, were not brought to you by normal market forces. They were brought to you in other ways. And it's not that market forces aren't good. It's the basis of an entire economy. It's the cornerstone of capitalism. It's the cornerstone of civic enterprise. There are a lot of things that is really important, but there are others where normal market forces don't do it. Now, I would even go on to say that when you look at the world that way, you don't try to optimize on one thing, like return on investment or whatever, because you don't have shareholders. You have stakeholders. You have humans. You have I just gave a talk yesterday to the International Telecommunications Union, which was the annual meeting of all of the cell phone carriers in the world. So there are a lot of them, about 2,000. And I begged them in the beginning, I said, please, for the next few minutes when you listen to me, park your role as CEO or CTO of a company and listen as a person, as a human. And then agree or disagree, but then go back to your role. And I'm not diminishing the role, but try not to use it as a filter for everything you hear. And I don't know if it worked or not, but the impact on cities of things that are going on right now are probably more important than the elevator. The form of Tokyo comes from the elevator. Almost nothing else drove that form as much as the elevator. It changed cities all over the world. So what is more important than the elevator? Well, one thing that's more important is driverless cars. This, by the way, my next sentence is not my extreme prediction, but it's a mild recommendation, is that the city of Tokyo should declare some date, maybe it's 2025, maybe it's 2022, you figure the number out, where only self-driving cars are allowed. Only. Do it quickly. Lead the world. because the self-driving car will eliminate parking, which is a massive amount of square footage that is being used to store cars that are used very rarely. It would eliminate most roads in terms of having to use, because there wouldn't be traffic as we know it. And it would reduce the number of cars by 90%, 90%, because my assumption is they would be shared economies, shared vehicles. Imagine what Tokyo would look like with no parking, no roads that are taking the kind of traffic, and only 10% of the vehicles that you currently have now. That would change the city of Tokyo. And the reason I show this slide is it's 20 years old. Sorry, it's 30 years old. If you're a car connoisseur, you might be able to tell from the car. But it was taken when a student of mine, and I have very few students who were directly my advisees, and he was doing, back in 1986, something he called backseat driver, which, because we knew of GPS and we knew, the idea was that it would tell you where to go. It was a mapping system long before Google Maps, long before Google, long before these things existed. And it was a speech production system, which was a thesis because how you give instructions is a very complex subject. For example, if you're driving and you are 100 meters in the city, 100 meters away from the next intersection, and you say, take a right at the next intersection, it's very clearly that intersection. But as you start getting closer and closer to the intersection, where, for example, you're now only 20 meters away from the intersection, what does next intersection mean? What does it mean, this one that's right there, or does it mean the next one? So the transition from the clarity of next at a distance to the ambiguity when you're close is a common linguistic one, which we don't really think of that, because as you get closer, you will start saying this intersection, take this one. Or you'll say, you passed it. But in other words, you will use different language as a consequence of where you are while you're driving. So this was thesis material. And when this young man, his name was Jim Davis, finished the thesis, we always pass the ideas by the MIT lawyers saying, do you think this is something MIT should patent? Because I said this seems like a really good thing that will be in the future. And the MIT lawyers said, no, don't patent it. It'll never happen. It'll be illegal because there'll be liability issues if you say, take the next right, and it's a one-way street and you have an accident. Whoever makes the machine will be sued. So much for lawyers, so much for vision, and it is indeed now very, very much part of our life, and I think it will very dramatically affect cities. The role of cities changed, and it's changing now. The reason I think most of us reluctantly hit culture and art is because it is culture and art, and the reluctance comes from the fact that the division between them is so fuzzy now. They're so interlocked. They are so much at one that the role of cities, we can say for sure, is social. It's social. In my era, adolescence lasted 3 years. You were an adolescent for 3 years, and by the time you were 19, you were an adult, and by the time you were 22, especially if you wanted to have sex, you got married. Now adolescence is like 20 years long. It starts very young, whatever, 13, 14, and it ends very late, early 30s. It's almost 20 years. And so adolescence, this may not be as true in Japan, but boy, it's true in the United States and Europe. Adolescence is a big period of life, the most exciting period, a very interesting one. Gender mixed, people live, share, and the shared economy is very much part of that 20-year period. And those people want to have fun. They want to go out for dinner. They want to go out of their apartment to a bar and meet friends and meet new relationships, have relationships. They don't want to be in the suburbs. They want to be in the city. And the city is the social scene for those people. And the shared economy is absolutely critical. My era, a sign of wealth was, how many houses do you have? And if you were a rich person, you'd say, well, I have 4. And the other one says, well, I have 6. And then you'd say where your houses were. They don't really aspire to that. They don't even think they have to own a house. One of our professors, who may or may not have talked at one of these events, is Kent Larson. Kent Larson, amongst other things, worked on the Media Lab's car. And he asked a class of about 30 people in the class, how many of you want to own a car? No hands went up. Not one hand. Doesn't that tell you something? Not one person wanted to own a car. I was in a talk the other day which was given in Boston, and the speaker on the stage was Arianna Huffington of the Huffington Post. And the moderator asked her, for some reason, cars came up. And she says, I don't use a car, I don't own a car, I just use Uber. And somebody else had asked, and I live in LA, the highway city of the planet. I live in LA and I don't own a car, I just use Uber. There is no economic reason to own a car anymore. Uber is cheaper. UberX is cheaper than a taxi. It's more convenient. You don't have to store it. You don't pay excise tax. You don't pay, mortgage or interest or whatever, however you financed it. It's, again, a message about the future, the shared economy. So what I'm going to end with is my controversial suggestion. For the past 20 years, I have worked mostly outside of cities. I have tried to look at the 70% roughly of the people in the world who are not in cities. Now, why did they come to cities historically? Well, one of the reasons rural and poor people came to cities was on a promise, a false promise, actually, for most of them, that if they came into the city, they would find work, their kids could go to school, and they could get a better life. The truth is that in the rural environment they were living, they were having a pretty good life. Maybe medicine wasn't great. Maybe their income wasn't high. But the quality of life in many regards that we admire, was a lot better than what they came to, which ended up being slums, being gangsters, being unsafe place, being all sorts of things. So the promise of going to the city has historically been, so far, a false promise for many, many people. So my question 20 years ago, is how can you end isolation? And when you do move to the city, you do it for not a false promise, but a real aspiration. That's the way you want to live. It'll probably be the young people that make the move because that's where they can date and meet and sort of, again, it takes them out of the village in other ways. So I worked on projects like one laptop per child and a satellite project right now to connect people and just the sorts of things you might expect me to do. But I bumped into, and maybe it's kind of self-evident, a very simple question, and a question that I've been asking more and more, and I usually get as an answer, yes. And the question is connectivity a human right? Now, when you ask that, it's an example of differences. Because one part of your brain says connectivity is like electricity and elevators and so on. But human rights is another part of my brain, and sort of I put them together. And if somebody pushes back, and you see I see they're pushing back, I say, okay, don't call it a human right. Is it a civic responsibility? Like streetlights, roads, primary schools, basic medicine, emergency medical, police. I can go down the line of things that aren't necessarily human rights, but they're civic responsibilities. So whether you argue or think it's a human right or civic responsibility, one thing that's true for all of those is they're free. Now, what does free mean? Free means that it is paid for by an economic model that assumes that all of society has been lifted up in some way, is prospering in some way, and guess what? They pay taxes. And those taxes are used for the common good. And that common good includes this infrastructure, which is education, roads, and so on. And in fact, I will go so far as to say that in many parts of the world, I don't know Japan well enough in this situation, but in the United States particularly, the worst thing that has happened to public education is private education. Because private education has sucked out of the system people who really care, can do something, want the most for their children, and who's left in public education? The people who actually don't have the position or power or money or rank to actually change it and make it really good. And when you look at the countries who are prospering in education, doing the best by the various measures and tests and rankings and so on, Finland is almost at the top of all of them. And usually it's an outlier. And guess what? Finland has no private education. There isn't any. It's all public education. It's considered part of the responsibility of society. And society makes the society better by elevating everybody. And a rich person walks down a sidewalk, a rich person uses the lights in the street, a rich person hopefully will even send their child to public education. So the point is that it is not who, and it's not a matter of it being paid for because you will charge some subset of the people. I practiced recently at the UN where many people in the audience were heads of state. And I said, Mr. and Mrs. Heads of State, I come to you and I make a suggestion. I say, I will educate every child in your country from 1st to 12th grade. And I'll do it at no cost to you. But, Mr. or Mrs. President, it'll all be private education. And you say, oh, no, we can't do that. We can't do it that way because there'll be some reason. So I say, okay, then I have another idea. If you don't like the first one, how about the second one? And the second one is, Mr. or Mrs. President, I will educate half your children for twice my cost, and I'll use all my profits to educate the other half. And you think about it for a moment, and you say, well, that sounds a little better, but I'm sorry, I can't do it, because it is part of my responsibility as a head of state. And, Mr. Negroponte, it's a mission, not a market. Missions and markets are big differences. Biggest difference I know. So if I can end on a difference before my suggestion, the biggest difference in the world is the difference between a market and a mission. And that doesn't mean you can't do some good things as a company and do some corporate social responsibility and do all these, et cetera, that are an important part of accomplishing your market because your shareholders respect you, your customers respect you. But that's still market stuff. That's not mission stuff. It's good. Please don't stop. If anybody's doing that, really good. But ask yourself the difference between a mission and a market sometimes when you do things yourself. And one of the reasons it's perhaps easy for me to say it, and for me to say things that are perfectly outrageous to groups who really don't want to hear them, is I have no lawyers behind me. Okay, I'm not here representing MIT. This is not MIT's voice. I don't have a vested interest. So at least you can probably believe that what I'm saying is what I feel, not because I'm marketing something or I want to get something done or so on. If anyway, I'm too old for that anyway. So now, what's my suggestion? My suggestion is the following, and the mayor of Tokyo has to be sitting down before you make this suggestion. If you believe, as I do, and I don't expect everybody in the room to believe it, but if you believe connectivity is a human right, then one aspect of human rights which is absolutely undeniable is they're free. They're free. A rich person doesn't get a little bit more of it, and the poor person a little bit less of it. Maybe there's unfairness in courts and other things, but the human right is defined by the eligibility is only being human. That's the only eligibility required. If you're a human, you've got it. And if it's a right, it's free. So what could a city do? Especially a big city, especially a city who wants to go from number 4 to number 1. Make internet free in Tokyo. Totally free. Whether that's 10 megabits symmetrical, whether it's a gigabit, you decide. And then the companies, the Docomos and others, they get paid the same way. They don't go out of business. They get paid the same way that people get paid for building schools, cleaning streets, running things. But basic, and this doesn't include the content and the information served, but basic internet service. If Tokyo made it free and said by the Olympics, broadband internet will be free to everybody in Tokyo. And you can look at the numbers. The numbers actually probably work. The reason that's so fundamental and why I think perhaps of all the cities you're the most important to do it is it's plausible. And people will look at you. And guess what? They'll copy Tokyo. They'll copy Tokyo because right now the people who are doing it are cities like Chattanooga, Tennessee. Who's going to copy Chattanooga? So it's something that a big city should consider doing, and I hope that's the one thing you take away from my introduction. Thank you very much.
Negroponte 様、ありがとうございます。
Professor Negroponte, thank you very much.